Before we start the story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. The desert's always been a strange place. Some say it's beautiful, others that it's haunted. For me, it was both. This time, though, I wasn't here for beauty or peace. I was here for the stories, the whispered legends about the nightstalkers, figures that supposedly haunt the Carlsbad Desert after dusk. Skeptics dismiss them as tricks of the light, but locals treat them like ghosts. I figured I'd find out for myself, as I often did. I parked my RV near the outskirts of Carlsbad Caverns National Park, miles from the main roads. The land was vast and silent, the sky an endless stark blue stretching over fields of sand and brittle brush. A few rugged cliffs dotted the landscape, and I knew there were petroglyphs on one of them, ancient markings, old as time. The day was brutal, as expected. The sun beat down relentlessly, and I took long sips from my canteen as I hiked through the dry landscape toward the cliff. When I finally reached it, I saw the drawings etched into the rock, a line of tall, thin figures with elongated limbs and hollow circles where their eyes should have been. They looked almost human, but somehow not. I ran my fingers over the carvings, the rock warm under my touch. My research suggested these were depictions of the nightstalkers, desert spirits that supposedly haunted the land. I didn't put much stock in the idea, but standing there alone, looking at those figures, I felt a strange chill, even in the relentless heat. It was like they were watching me. I shrugged off the feeling and spent the rest of the day hiking, exploring some lesser-known caves around the area, snapping a few photos. By evening, I was exhausted, my skin sunburned and my throat parched. I returned to the RV, ready to settle in and let the desert night lull me to sleep. But when night fell, that lull never came. I sat outside my RV under a blanket of stars, sipping from my flask and listening to the coyotes howling somewhere in the distance. It was quiet. Too quiet. And then I saw them. At first, I thought they were just shadows, maybe just tricks of the light. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized there was something standing out there, just beyond the edge of my campfire's glow. I squinted, thinking it was just a cactus or a cluster of rocks, but no. These figures were tall, thin, and standing upright, watching me. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to get a better look, but they melted back into the darkness before I could focus on them. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe it was just the dark playing tricks on me. I shook my head and went inside the RV, locking the door behind me. The desert was vast, empty. Surely I was alone out here. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing things, a faint scratching on the walls, soft rustling sounds, even what sounded like footsteps outside. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe a coyote passing by, but when I finally forced myself up to check, flashlight in hand, there was nothing there. Just the quiet, endless desert stretching into the night. But in the sand around my RV, I saw something else. Footprints. Bare, human-looking footprints leading away from the RV, deeper into the desert. The next day, I tried to shake off the fear gnawing at my mind. I'd come here to see something supernatural, and now my imagination was running wild. Determined to face my fears head-on, I followed the footprints back toward the caves. The footprints led me to a cave I hadn't noticed before, set into the base of a jagged cliff half hidden behind thorny brush. I hesitated at the entrance, feeling a strange reluctance to step inside. But curiosity won out. I ducked into the cool darkness, sweeping my flashlight over the walls. More petroglyphs lined the cave walls, these ones even more unsettling. The figures were twisted, elongated, with hollow eyes that seemed to follow me as I moved. Below them, a faint inscription in ancient script. I couldn't read it, but I remembered the translation I'd read in an old research journal. They watch in silence. They follow in shadow. A shiver ran down my spine, and I backed out of the cave, my breathing shallow. I wanted to leave, but some part of me needed to know more. That night, I forced myself to stay calm, to sit outside my RV and just observe. I lit a small fire and sat there, watching the stars, letting my mind drift. But then I saw them again. The figures, 3 of them this time, standing just at the edge of the firelight. They were closer now, their tall, thin bodies almost human, but twisted, distorted in ways I couldn't understand. They didn't move. They just stared, watching me with those hollow eyes. My hands trembled and I gripped my flashlight, but I didn't dare turn it on. I remembered the petroglyph's warning, the stories the locals told. The nightstalkers only grew bolder if you acknowledged them. So I kept my gaze fixed on the fire, refusing to look directly at them, even as every instinct screamed at me to run. The night dragged on, the air thick with tension. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, the figures shifting slightly, edging closer. I could hear a faint, low hum coming from their direction, like a deep, unsettling vibration that echoed through the desert night. I held my breath, my heart pounding, clinging to the hope that they would disappear with dawn. Around midnight, the scratching started again, louder this time, more insistent. It was coming from the side of the RV, a slow, dragging sound, like fingernails scraping metal. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of my seat, forcing myself to stay still, to pretend I didn't hear it. But the noise didn't stop. It grew louder, moving around the RV until it was directly outside the door. I stared straight ahead, my mouth dry, willing myself not to move. But then the humming shifted, turning into a whisper. Faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew they were calling me, beckoning me. The fire flickered, casting shadows against the walls of the RV. I looked away, my breath shallow, my grip tightening on my flashlight. Just last until dawn, I told myself. Just last until dawn. But then a soft knock echoed from the RV door. My blood ran cold. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to throw open the door and confront whatever was out there. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't a person. It wasn't anything human. The knock came again, softer this time, almost polite. I sat there, frozen, my entire body tense, refusing to respond. After a long, breathless moment, the sound faded, and the desert fell silent once more. When the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I let out a shaky breath. I'd made it. The night was over. I forced myself up, moving stiffly, and peeked outside. The desert was empty, just as it had been when I arrived. No figures, no shadows, but as I turned to climb back into the RV, my eyes fell on the ground. The sand around my RV was covered in footprints, hundreds of them all barefoot, all leading away from the RV, deeper into the desert. It was as if the nightstalkers had circled me all night, waiting for something. I shivered, pulling my jacket closer, and climbed into the RV, my mind racing. I needed to leave, to get as far from Carlsbad as possible. The RV's engine sputtered to life, and I pulled out onto the desert road, watching the vast, empty landscape stretch out behind me. The sun was rising, casting the cliffs in warm orange light, and for a moment, I felt a sense of relief, of safety. The nightmare was over. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw it. A lone figure standing on the horizon, watching me. Its form was tall, slender, elongated, one of the nightstalkers staring after me as I drove away. I pressed down on the gas, my hands gripping the wheel, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back again. Now, back in town, I'm safe. Or at least I should be. But the experience haunts me, lingering at the edge of my mind, just like the figures that stalked me in the desert. Sometimes in the dead of night, I hear the faint hum, that low vibration, echoing through the silence. I know they're still out there watching, waiting, and every time I close my eyes, I see those hollow faces staring at me, beckoning. One night I might answer. It was supposed to be a straightforward trip. I'd come to the Great Smoky Mountains looking for a forgotten piece of history. A ghost town buried under generations of forest growth and local legend. Silent Hill, they called it, though I'd found almost no information in the history books, just hints and whispers from old journals and archived news clippings. This is what I did for a living. Find the hidden history. Expose the forgotten stories. I was burned out after years of documentaries that all felt the same. I needed something new. Something that could wake me up. The mystery of Silent Hill seemed perfect. Greenbrier Campground was quiet this time of year, just a few other campers spread around, most of them leaving each morning for hikes. I parked my RV in a spot along the edge of the forest and immediately felt uneasy. I told myself it was the thrill of the mystery, that mix of fear and excitement I always felt before a new project. But there was something else here, too. A pressure in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I decided to hit the trails right away, leaving my pack in the RV and grabbing my camera and notebook. The sun was sinking fast, casting a reddish light across the trees as I followed the main trail into the forest. That's when I saw the ranger, a tall, wiry man with a weathered face. He gave me a nod, but didn't smile. "Looking for something in particular?" he asked, glancing at my notebook. "Actually, yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "Have you heard of an old settlement called Silent Hill? Supposedly it's somewhere in this area." The ranger's face tightened. "Silent Hill," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I've heard of it, but you're better off sticking to the marked trails." "Why's that?" I pressed, intrigued. "Some places are meant to be forgotten," he said simply, his gaze drifting into the trees. "Folks who wander too far into that part of the forest don't always make it back. It's like it keeps them, like it wants them to stay." I laughed it off as local superstition. "Appreciate the warning," I said, trying to keep my tone light, "but I think I'll take my chances." The ranger didn't argue. He just nodded and walked off, disappearing into the shadowy tree line. That night, I tried to sleep, but I kept hearing faint rustling sounds around the RV, like something moving outside. The wind, I told myself, trying to ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, the feeling was still there, an awareness of being watched. I brushed it off and grabbed my map, deciding to start my search for Silent Hill. The ranger's warning lingered, but my curiosity was stronger. I'd come here for a story, and I was determined to find it. The trail started well enough. I followed an overgrown path that twisted through the trees, marking my road on the map as I went. After a few hours, I started to see signs of an old settlement. Remnants of stone walls, collapsed log cabins, and a shallow, dried-up well. The air was thick, heavy with a silence that felt unnatural, as if every sound had been swallowed up. As I approached one of the larger ruins, a cabin mostly overtaken by vines, I noticed faint carvings on the wood. They looked like symbols, rough and ancient, scratched into the weathered planks. My pulse quickened as I traced one with my finger. It felt cold, colder than the air around me, and for a moment I thought I heard children's laughter, faint and distant. "Hello," I called out, though I knew it was impossible that anyone else would be here. Only silence answered. I snapped a few photos, trying to ignore the feeling that something was watching me. The forest was still, almost too still, the kind of silence that made my skin crawl. In one of the cabins, I found an old journal lying in the dirt. The pages were brittle, almost crumbling, but some words were still legible. Cursed land. Never alone. The silent children. The last entry trailed off mid-sentence, the ink smeared as though the writer had left in a hurry. I returned to the RV just as the sky began to darken, my head spinning with thoughts of the strange journal. I felt like I was on the edge of something big, but a nagging feeling of dread had started to creep in. There was a heaviness in the air, a pressure that hadn't been there before. That night, I sat in the RV, going over the journal, but I couldn't focus. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing there, watching me. Then I heard it. A faint tapping on the window, soft but rhythmic, like tiny fingers drumming against the glass. My breath caught. I stood up slowly, moving toward the window, but the tapping stopped just before I reached it. My hands were shaking as I backed away, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a branch blowing in the wind. But I knew better. Whatever it wasn't done with me. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes I heard the tapping again, followed by faint, childlike laughter. By morning, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed, but I couldn't shake the pull of Silent Hill. I had to go back. The forest felt different this time, more disoriented. Paths that had seemed clear the day before were overgrown now, and familiar landmarks had shifted, as though the forest itself was moving, changing to confuse me. I found my way back to the settlement, but this time it felt darker, as if shadows clung to every corner. Then I saw it. The well. Half hidden by brambles and vines, its stones covered in moss and strange markings. I felt drawn to it, a strange compulsion pushing me forward. I peered into the well, holding my breath. The bottom was pitch black, but as I stared, I thought I saw something move. A hand, pale and small, reaching up from the darkness. I stumbled back, heart racing, convinced I was seeing things. Then I heard the laughter again, closer this time. I spun around, but no one was there. The forest was empty, silent, but I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. I ran, the journal forgotten, my heart pounding as I scrambled through the underbrush. Every step seemed to echo, the laughter following me, growing louder with every turn. I thought I saw shadows flitting between the trees, small figures darting in and out of sight, always just beyond reach. When I finally made it back to the RV, I slammed the door behind me, locking it and collapsing into the driver's seat, my hands shaking. I told myself I'd imagined it all, that exhaustion was playing tricks on me. But then I noticed something odd. My audio recorder, which I'd left on the table, was on recording. I hadn't touched it since yesterday. My heart raced as I pressed play, listening to the faint static that filled the small speakers. Then I heard a voice. It was faint, distorted, but I recognized it immediately. It was my own voice, repeating my name over and over, almost like a chant. Dan, Dan, come back. My blood ran cold. I hadn't recorded this, hadn't said those words, but there was no mistaking my voice. I listened in horror as the voice grew louder, more insistent, until it was practically shouting, Dan, don't leave! I shut off the recorder, my hands shaking. I knew I had to leave, that whatever had drawn me here had no intention of letting me go. I grabbed my keys and turned the ignition, desperate to get out. But the RV wouldn't start. The engine whined and clicked, refusing to turn over. That's when I heard it, the tapping again, this time on the back window. Soft, insistent, like fingers drumming against the glass. I froze, my mind racing, the laughter echoing in my ears. Slowly, I turned, expecting to see, I don't know what, but the window was empty. There was nothing there, just the dark, empty forest stretching on forever. I tried the ignition again, this time whispering a silent prayer. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas, tearing down the dirt path, desperate to put as much distance between myself and Silent Hill as possible. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the children standing in the road watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the dark, empty road behind me. It wasn't until I was halfway down the mountain that I noticed something odd. In the reflection of the mirror, I could see faint smudges on the back window, small handprints, dozens of them, as if someone had pressed their palms against the glass from the outside. My stomach twisted, and I forced myself to look away, my mind racing. I don't know what happened in Silent Hill. Don't know if it was the curse of the land or the spirits of those who vanished, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was, it had been waiting for me. They found my RV a week later, abandoned at a rest stop just outside the Smokies. My camera and notebook were still inside, along with the journal, but I was gone. Just another lost soul in Silent Hill's history. They say that on quiet nights, campers near Greenbrier still hear laughter drifting through the trees, faint and distant, like children playing. And if you listen closely, you might hear a voice calling out, a man's voice pleading to be found. They call it Devil's Backbone, a stretch of rocky ridge out in Texas hill country. I'd heard stories about it my whole life. Ghost sightings, strange lights, whispers in the night. And after a rough year of a divorce and long days at the mechanic shop, I needed something. I couldn't quite explain it, but I wanted to feel connected to something beyond the everyday grind. So I took my RV out there, figuring I'd relax, drink a few cold ones, and maybe catch a glimpse of one of those famous ghost riders the locals talked about. I arrived just before sunset, parking on a bluff overlooking the ridge. The air had that dry Texas heat, but something felt off right away. There was an unusual silence. Not a bird, not an insect, just me, the wind, and that vast, quiet ridge. I shrugged it off, figuring I just wasn't used to the area, but as I started setting up, an older man walked by my camp, eyeing my RV, "You campin' here alone?" he asked, his face shadowed under a wide-brimmed hat. "Yeah, just here for the weekend," I replied, trying to keep it friendly. He didn't smile back, just narrowed his eyes. "Don't wander too far after dark," he warned. "The spirits here don't take kindly to strangers." I chuckled, thinking it was just local color, but the man didn't laugh. He just nodded, tipped his hat, and walked off, leaving me with a chill I couldn't shake. By the time I'd finished setting up, the sun was dipping behind the hills, casting a red glow across the landscape. I grabbed a blanket, sat outside the RV, and settled in with a beer, watching as the last light slipped away. Just as dusk set in, the temperature plummeted. I tugged my jacket closer, surprised by the chill. It was Texas in late spring. It shouldn't have been this cold. I felt a prickling on the back of my neck, an eerie sense that I wasn't alone. I brushed it off, but something kept tugging at me, like the quiet was too quiet. It was nearly full dark when I saw the first sign of something. Out of the corner of my eye, a light flickered, bobbing along the ridge. It was faint, yellowish, almost like an old lantern swinging in someone's hand. I squinted, trying to see if it was another camper, but the light moved strangely, almost like it was swaying back and forth, getting closer, then moving away. Then it vanished completely. Just as quickly, the sound of hoofbeats reached my ears, echoing through the silence. They were faint at first, then louder, closer, until I could almost feel the thud of each step reverberating in my chest. I couldn't see anything at first, just darkness swallowing the ridge. But then, silhouetted against the night sky, I saw him, a lone rider on horseback, drifting along the ridge like smoke. I froze, heart pounding as the figure turned toward me. He was just close enough that I could make out the outline of a wide-brimmed hat and the gleam of something slung over his shoulder, maybe a rifle. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe. Ghost or not, I didn't want any part of it. I backed into the RV, locking the door, trying to shake off the feeling, but that wasn't the end of it. Not by a long shot. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept hearing things. Footsteps crunching in the gravel outside, faint whispering voices I couldn't understand. I'd never been one to scare easy, but this was different. It wasn't like the horror movies or ghost tours I'd laughed off before. This felt real. The footsteps circled my RV, stopping right by the door. I held my breath, listening to the sounds of low, murmured voices. They didn't speak English, but the tone was unmistakable. Angry, resentful, like they knew I was there and weren't happy about it. I crept to the window, peeking out, but there was nothing but my own boot prints in the dirt. The voices stopped as soon as I stepped back, leaving me standing in the eerie silence of the RV, heart racing. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just hearing things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then, just as I was about to climb back into bed, I saw it. The lantern light again, flickering just outside the window. This time, it was close. Too close. I barely slept that night, staying up with a flashlight and my pocket knife, listening to every sound, every creak. I kept hearing that damn voice whispering my name. "Aaron," it said, low and haunting, like a chant, like it was trying to pull me outside. By the time dawn rolled around, I was exhausted, but determined not to let the ghost stories get to me. I told myself it was all in my head, a trick of the dark and too much whiskey. But the memory of that ghostly rider and those scratch marks on the RV stayed with me. needling at the edge of my mind. The second night, I thought about packing up and leaving, but I was stubborn. I told myself I'd come here for peace, and I'd stay until I got it. But as the sun went down, a heavy storm rolled in out of nowhere. Lightning cracked across the ridge, illuminating shadowy figures just beyond the tree line, figures that seemed to flicker in and out of existence with each flash. And then the drums started. It was a deep, rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from all around me, blending with the thunder. It reminded me of the old war drums I'd heard in movies, but there was a force to it that made my skin crawl. The pounding grew louder, faster, like it was moving closer, surrounding the RV. I tried to start the engine, but the RV wouldn't turn over. Panicked, I banged my fists against the steering wheel, cursing under my breath, trying to force myself to think logically. But with each passing second, the drumming grew louder, closer, until it was pounding in my chest like a heartbeat. The air inside the RV grew cold, and I felt an icy hand brush against my shoulder. I whipped around, but there was no one there, just the empty silence of the RV. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I stumbled outside, heart racing, my breath fogging in the air as I shouted into the night. "I don't know what you want, but I'm leaving. You hear me? I'm sorry for trespassing, but I'm getting out of here." For a moment, the drumming stopped. The air grew warmer, the wind died down, and a strange sense of calm washed over me. It was as if I'd been given permission to leave. I scrambled back into the RV, trying the engine again. This time it roared to life, and I didn't waste a second, gunning it down the dirt road as fast as I dared. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the rider or those shadowy figures chasing after me. Just as the ridge faded in the distance, I heard a faint, echoing scream, followed by the sound of galloping hooves. It was distant, but clear enough that I felt the chill settle back in my bones. I didn't stop until I reached the small town at the base of the ridge. I pulled into a diner, hands shaking as I gripped my coffee, feeling the warmth seep into my fingers, grounding me. The older man behind the counter gave me a knowing look. "You camp up at Devil's Backbone?" he asked, his eyes sharp as if he already knew the answer. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, thought it'd be quiet up there." He shook his head, giving a soft chuckle. "Quiet, sure, but that's haunted ground. Too many souls lost over the years, old ghosts that don't like to be disturbed. Lone campers up there. They tend to get a special welcome." I shuddered, unable to bring myself to say much else. I didn't need to. I just nodded and paid my bill, eager to put as much distance between me and Devil's Backbone as I could. That was months ago, and I haven't set foot in a forest since. Sometimes at night, I still hear the faint thud of hooves and the low murmur of that voice calling my name. Maybe it's my imagination, a trick of memory, but deep down, I know better. Some places carry the weight of history, of memories too dark to ever truly fade. And some of those memories, they're not ready to let go. I'd always thought I knew these mountains like the back of my hand. After years in the military, and then as a survival instructor, the wilderness had become second nature to me. But that didn't stop the shadows of Mount Hood from feeling strange, off. It was hard to put my finger on it, but the quiet solitude I'd always loved felt heavy this time, like something was watching me. I'd come out here to scout new routes for my wilderness school and maybe even test myself. A solo camping trip had always been my way of clearing my head. shaking off the nightmares that crept in when life got too quiet. I parked my RV at a secluded spot near the base of the mountain, knowing I wouldn't see another soul for miles. But on the first night, something was different. I should have known the moment the cold snap hit. The forecast had been clear, maybe a little chilly, but nothing like this. By midnight, a biting, unnatural cold had settled in, and I felt it seeping through the walls of the RV. I bundled up in my sleeping bag, telling myself it was just bad luck, that mountain weather could change at any moment. But the cold was persistent. It crawled under my skin, a chill that seemed to whisper, "Stay awake, don't fall asleep." That was when I heard it. A sound low and guttural, almost like a howl drifting through the trees. It rose and fell, echoing off the mountains, but it wasn't like any animal call I'd ever heard. No wolf, no coyote. This sound was human-like, almost plaintive, as if someone were crying out for help, their voice stretched and distorted by the night air. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease. It was the isolation playing tricks on me, I told myself. I'd come here to be alone, and alone I'd be. But the next morning, I found something that shattered my calm. There were footprints around my RV, massive, elongated, and barefoot. They looked almost human, but too big, with twisted claw-like impressions at the toes. My first thought was to dismiss it as an animal, maybe a bear or something unusual in the area. But something about the shape didn't sit right with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself to ignore it and set out with my camera, determined to get some shots for my wilderness program. I'd let this cold, this isolation get to me for no good reason. But as I was snapping photos of a patch of frosted trees, I noticed something in the distance. There, standing on the ridge, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a tree or a shadow, but as I focused, the figure came into view. It was tall, thin, and pale, with limbs that seemed to stretch in unnatural ways. The thing was watching me. I knew that somehow in the deepest part of my mind, with that primal animal instinct that tells you when you're being hunted. I forced myself to look away, closing my eyes to shake off the image. When I looked back, the figure was gone. I laughed at myself, a low, humorless chuckle that didn't feel like me. This was absurd. I'd spent my life in these woods, and I wasn't about to let a shadow spook me. But the footprints, they were real. As the day wore on, the chill didn't lift. I felt a gnawing emptiness in my gut, a cold hunger that seemed to sap my energy no matter how much I ate or drank. By evening, I was weak, shaky, and disoriented. I'd been rationing my food, knowing I'd be out here for a few days, but my supplies seemed thinner than I remembered packing. The oatmeal packets were crumpled, my water lower than it should have been, as if something had been taken from me when I wasn't looking. That night, I tried to sleep, but the howling returned, closer and louder, echoing through the trees. It was the same sound, a twisted, broken wail that wasn't quite human, but not quite animal either. It was maddening, a sound that wormed its way into my mind, filling every corner of my thoughts. I lay there, shivering, feeling more alone than I had in years, fighting off a creeping sense of dread that felt as old as the forest itself. By dawn, I was desperate to leave. I packed up my things, only to find that my RV wouldn't start. I turned the key, and the engine sputtered and died again and again until the battery itself seemed to drain. With each failed attempt, I felt my heart pound harder, a frantic rhythm that seemed to sync with the cold around me. I had no choice. I'd have to hike out and get help, or at least get myself to a ranger station. But as I stepped out of the RV, I felt it. The eyes watching me. I looked around, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. And then, in the corner of my vision, I caught a glimpse of it. The figure was back, standing just within the shadows of the trees, taller than any man, with eyes like hollow pits, black and endless. I froze, my breath catching, every instinct telling me to run. But my legs wouldn't move. Its face looked almost human, but stretched, distorted, like something had molded it into a twisted mockery of life. The thing raised one long, bony hand, pointing toward me, and though it didn't move, I felt it in my bones, a deep, primal hunger that radiated from its body, a hunger that reached into me and left me hollow. In a panic, I grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the trees, but the figure was gone, vanishing like mist. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I felt a dizziness settle over me. My stomach churned, empty and aching, as if I hadn't eaten in days. I stumbled back to the RV, clutching my sides, fighting off a wave of nausea. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the figure appeared in my mind, its empty eyes boring into me. The hunger grew worse, gnawing at my insides, filling my thoughts with images of food, of meat, of tearing flesh from bone. It was madness, a dark hunger that consumed every part of me. That night, the howling was right outside my door. I lay there, paralyzed, listening to the low, mournful wail, feeling it reverberate through my bones. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Silence. A suffocating, unnatural silence. I stayed still, listening, waiting, until a faint scratching started up on the side of the RV. Slow, deliberate, as if something was testing the metal, looking for a way in. I grabbed the fire starter from my pack, my last line of defense, my only comfort. With shaky hands, I struck it, lighting a small flame in my palm, holding it up like a shield. The scratching stopped, and for a moment, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe it was afraid of the fire. But then I heard it, a whisper, low and mocking, right outside the door. "Calvin," it said, my name drawn out in a raspy, guttural tone. "Calvin, come out." My blood ran cold. How did it know my name? The voice called again, softer this time, almost coaxing. "Calvin, you're hungry, aren't you?" I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the fire starter until my knuckles went white. "You're not real," I whispered, trying to block out the voice, the cold, the hunger gnawing at my insides. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear, filling my mind with images of blood, flesh, tearing and gnashing. The hunger grew unbearable, twisting my insides, making me feel like I was starving, desperate. "No!" I screamed, forcing myself to light a fire in the RV's small stove, letting the flames crackle and grow. The light pushed back the shadows, warming the air, and I felt the presence pull away, retreating into the cold, watching from a distance. The whispers faded, but I knew it was still there, lurking in the darkness, waiting. By dawn, I was a wreck, half-starved, haunted, barely able to think straight. I stumbled out of the RV, lighting matches and holding them up as I made my way toward the nearest trail. Every shadow felt like a threat, every gust of wind carrying that low, mocking whisper. I don't know how long I walked before I saw the ranger station on the horizon. It felt like a mirage, a beacon in the distance, but I pushed forward, forcing myself to keep going, step by painful step. When I stumbled inside, the rangers stared at me, their faces a mix of shock and horror. I must have looked half dead, frostbitten and haunted. They tried to talk to me, to ask what had happened, but I couldn't find the words. All I could think about was the hunger, the cold, and those hollow eyes watching me from the trees. They got me home eventually, patched me up, but the experience never left me. Even now, in the comfort of my own home, I feel it sometimes, that cold hunger, that gnawing emptiness that nothing can fill. And when I wake up in the dead of night, I can still hear it. The howling echoing through the trees, calling me back to the mountains. No matter how far I go, I know it's waiting for me, somewhere in the shadows with those hollow, hungry eyes. And someday, I fear I might answer its call. They say Blackwater Bayou has eyes. Or, as the woman at the gas station put it, the bayou knows who's on its land, and it doesn't always take kindly to visitors. I gave her a polite smile and thanked her for the warning, but I didn't put much stock in ghost stories or local superstition. I was here on a mission to capture a photo of the ivory-billed woodpecker, one of the most elusive birds in North America. If I could manage it, that one image would be the crowning achievement of my wildlife photography career. I was alone, parked in a remote part of the bayou. I'd driven my RV deep into the swamp, leaving behind the beaten paths, eager to be the only human for miles. The thought thrilled me. Here, I could think clearly, free from the memories of my recent divorce and the feeling of failure that had shadowed me since. Just me, my camera, and nature. But I was beginning to think the bayou didn't want me here. The trouble started almost as soon as I parked. Batteries drained faster than normal, my camera's memory card corrupted twice, and every shot I managed to take had some strange distortion, as though a shadow clung to the edges of the frame. I cleaned the lenses and restarted the camera, but it didn't help. The swamp was thick and heavy with shadows, and the air itself seemed to cling to me, sticky and humid, with a scent that was equal parts decay and salt water. The next day, I set out on foot, winding through gnarled trees and roots that stretched like fingers through the muddy water. The sun barely pierced the thick canopy overhead, and in the dim light, everything looked otherworldly. Spanish moss hung down like shrouds, twisting around tree limbs, and the air was thick with mist. I felt like I'd stepped back in time, as if the swamp held memories of things long dead but never fully gone. Halfway through my hike, I noticed something strange, a series of markings on the trees. Symbols scratched into the bark, their edges blurred by moss and age. They looked almost like wards, like something you'd see in a horror movie meant to keep a spirit contained. I took a picture, but the camera sputtered, then shut off. Figures, I muttered, stuffing it back into my bag. I kept moving, ignoring the nagging feeling that I was being watched. I'd been in remote areas before, but this was different. The bayou had a weight to it, an awareness that felt personal. That evening, as the fog rolled in and I sat by a small fire outside my RV, I couldn't shake the feeling of something just beyond the circle of light. I told myself it was just the swamp playing tricks. After all, that's what swamps do. Shadows twist in the fog. Branches look like fingers reaching out. But when I glanced up from my dinner, I froze. A figure stood in the distance, barely visible through the mist. It was tall, too tall to be a man, with limbs that stretched unnaturally long. Its face was obscured, draped in moss and shadows, and it seemed almost to blend into the swamp around it, as if it were made of the bayou itself. I blinked, and it was gone. Just shadows, I told myself, nothing more. But as I turned back to my meal, I noticed a handprint on the RV's door, large, muddy, and dripping. I hadn't heard anyone approach, and there were no footprints around it. Just that single handprint pressed into the metal. A chill ran down my spine, and I retreated inside, locking the door. I told myself I was being ridiculous. The swamp played tricks, and I was letting it get into my head. The next night was worse. I'd barely fallen asleep when I heard it, whispering outside the RV, low and guttural. I pressed my ear against the wall, straining to hear, but the words were jumbled, almost like they were in a different language. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they were coming from all sides, surrounding me. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and shone it out the window. The light caught something in the distance, a pair of eyes, red and burning, staring straight at me. My heart raced as the eyes blinked, then vanished into the shadows. The whispers stopped, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. I sat in the dark, clutching the flashlight, too afraid to sleep. By morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream, maybe the product of exhaustion. But when I stepped outside, I saw fresh claw marks gouged into the side of the RV, long and jagged, like something with claws had dragged its hand across the metal. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was out here, and it didn't want me in its territory. I thought about packing up and leaving, but the ivory-billed woodpecker haunted my thoughts. I was so close, and I couldn't bear the idea of returning empty-handed. Determined to prove myself, I headed deeper into the bayou, following a trail of old, overgrown paths. The trees grew denser, the mist thicker, and the symbols on the trees became more frequent, almost as if they were trying to keep me from going further. And then I saw it. The creature. It stood at the edge of the water, half covered in moss and vines, towering over the swamp like a guardian of the land. Its skin was pale, stretched thin over its elongated frame, and its eyes glowed red even in the daylight. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stared. I stumbled back, my breath catching. The camera around my neck clicked on its own, capturing blurry, fragmented images of the thing before me. I didn't dare move, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It was as though the swamp itself had come alive, taking form just to watch me, to warn me. Finally, I found my voice. "I'm just here to take photos," I stammered, as if reasoning with a monster could somehow help. The creature tilted its head, almost curious. Then it stepped forward, its movement silent and smooth, as if it were gliding through the water. I turned and ran, branches whipping at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, my breath ragged and desperate. I could feel it following me, a silent presence just at the edge of my vision. The swamp twisted around me, every path leading back to where I'd seen it. Finally, I broke through the trees and stumbled back to the RV, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it, barricading myself inside, heart pounding so hard I thought it might break. I didn't sleep that night. Every few hours I'd hear soft scratching at the door, quiet but deliberate, as though it were testing the strength of the RV. My camera flickered on by itself, flashing images of the dark swamp, though I hadn't touched it. When dawn finally broke, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. I threw my gear together, my hands shaking as I packed up. But as I tried to turn the ignition, the RV wouldn't start. The engine choked, sputtered, and died. "No," I whispered, panic clawing up my throat. "Come on." But it was useless. The RV was dead. A shadow passed over the window. I looked up, heart stopping as I saw the creature standing just outside, its hand pressed against the glass, watching me with those burning red eyes. This time, I couldn't pretend it was a trick of the light. Desperate, I grabbed my camera and swung open the door, aiming the lens at the creature. The flash went off, illuminating its hollow, gaunt face for the first time. It didn't flinch. It only stared, almost like it was studying me, considering me. Then, slowly, it raised a long, clawed hand and pointed back into the bayou, as if showing me the way. I understood then. It wasn't here to kill me, at least not yet. It wanted me to leave, to follow the path back out and never return. The swamp wasn't mine to claim. Heart hammering, I nodded, stepping back slowly. "I'll go. I'll leave." It lowered its hand, watching as I gathered my things and stepped down from the RV. As I made my way back through the twisted trees, I felt it watching me, guiding me from a distance, making sure I didn't stray. When I finally reached the edge of the bayou, I looked back one last time. The creature was gone, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, warning me to never come back. I drove for hours without stopping, heart racing, my mind replaying the last image my camera had captured. A shadowy figure, barely visible, but real enough to haunt me. They say the bayou has eyes, and as I left Blackwater Bayou, I knew they were watching, ensuring I never forgot who the land truly belonged to. The park ranger gave me a funny look when I told him I was planning to spend a week alone at Devil's Den. "Quiet place," he'd said, eyeing me like he knew something I didn't. I told myself it was just his way of being helpful, but I couldn't shake his gaze as I drove deeper into the park, trees closing in around me, the sunlight turning to shadows. I parked my RV on the edge of a secluded spot near the trailhead. The surrounding forest seemed thick and endless, a dense green that swallowed sound. This trip was supposed to help me find peace, or whatever approximation of it was left for me. Ever since Hannah passed, I'd been looking for something to fill the emptiness. Grief had a way of taking up space, a silent presence that followed you everywhere. That first day, I tried to focus on the geology that had once fascinated me. Devil's Den was a rare place, with its caves and rock formations formed millions of years ago. I'd brought my equipment, hoping to do a bit of exploring, maybe rediscover that old spark. But that first night, something felt wrong. It was the lantern that went out first. I'd checked it before I left, tested every battery, every bulb. But as I sat outside the RV, listening to the creaking of the trees, the light began to dim, flickering until it finally died. I fumbled with my flashlight, only to find it, too, was dimming rapidly. "Great," I muttered, but my voice seemed swallowed by the dark. It was as if the trees had absorbed the sound, leaving nothing but silence. And then I heard it, a faint whisper just behind me. I whipped around, flashlight in hand, but the beam barely pierced the thick darkness. There was nothing, just the quiet rustling of leaves. I shook my head, laughing to myself, if only to keep the unease at bay. But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was there, watching. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I hadn't been sleeping well, and grief had a way of twisting the senses. So I went back inside, locking the door behind me, the whisper echoing in the back of my mind. The next day, I set out on a hike, hoping a bit of sunlight and exercise would help. Devil's Den was known for its rugged trails and dense woods, a place both beautiful and strange. I'd barely gone a mile when I noticed something strange. Dark, shifting shadows moving just beyond the trees. At first, I thought it was just light filtering through the canopy, casting odd patterns. But the shadows seemed too deliberate. Every time I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they moved. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and even looked away. But every time I looked back, they were there, just out of reach. I tried to dismiss it, even laughed it off. "You're seeing things, Ryan. Get a grip." But the laughter felt hollow, a reminder that I was alone. A few hours later, I found myself in a clearing. I stopped to catch my breath, and that's when I noticed something lying in the grass, a rusted old compass. It looked ancient, worn by time, its face covered in scratches. The needle was spinning wildly, as if unable to find its bearings. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand, feeling an odd chill seep through my skin. And then I saw it, a photograph half buried in the dirt. It was worn and faded, but there was no mistaking it. The woman in the picture looked eerily like Hannah. My breath hitched. No, it couldn't be. I turned the photo over, but there was nothing to explain why it was here, why it looked so much like her. I pocketed the photo and compass, though I didn't know why. Maybe some part of me hoped it was a sign, some impossible message. But even as I tried to rationalize it, an unease began to settle in my bones. I turned back toward camp, picking up my pace as the shadows lengthened around me. As I walked, I could have sworn I heard footsteps following me, soft and measured, keeping time with my own. I didn't dare look back. By the time I returned to the RV, the fog had rolled in, thick and unrelenting, like a blanket swallowing the trees and everything beyond. I locked the door, gripping the flashlight tightly, my hands shaking. I told myself it was just exhaustion, but the rational part of me was fading, giving way to something colder, more primal. The whispers started again that night, louder this time, as if pressing against the walls of the RV. I lay on the bunk, eyes open, trying to ignore the sound, but it crept in, filling the silence with fragments of words I couldn't quite understand. And then, clear as day, I heard her voice. "Ryan." I sat up, my heart racing. It was impossible, a trick of the mind, but the sound was unmistakable. Hannah's voice, soft and familiar, calling to me from outside. "Ryan, come find me." I squeezed my eyes shut, shaking my head. This isn't real. It can't be real. But the whispers grew louder, filling my head with memories, with her laughter, her smile. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight, took a deep breath, and opened the door. The fog was so thick I could barely see my hand in front of me, but I stepped out, following the sound, my heart pounding with equal parts fear and hope. The whispers led me deeper into the forest, each step taking me further from camp. The trees loomed overhead, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out, twisting in the fog. And then, just ahead, I saw her. Hannah, standing beneath a tree, her face pale and shadowed, her eyes sad but familiar. She reached out to me, her voice a soft whisper. "Ryan, I've been waiting for you." I stumbled forward, reaching out. but as I drew closer, her form began to blur, her face dissolving into shadows. The figure morphed, twisting into something dark and hollow, a shadow with elongated limbs and empty eyes that seemed to swallow the light. My blood turned to ice. This thing, whatever it was, had taken her shape, lured me out here with her voice. I stumbled back, tripping over a root, my flashlight falling to the ground. The beam flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance around me. The shadow figure stepped closer, its face blank, its eyes endless pits of darkness. And then, as if reaching into my mind, it began to speak, its voice shifting and distorting, becoming a chorus of whispers that clawed at my sanity. "Ryan, you can stay with us." I scrambled back, grabbing the flashlight, the beam flickering weakly as I swung it toward the creature. The light seemed to drive it back, but only slightly, as if it were merely amused. It loomed over me, a dark presence that filled the air with a suffocating weight. In a desperate bid, I turned and ran, my heart hammering as I stumbled through the fog, branches clawing at my skin. The whispers followed me, taunting, growing louder with each step. I ran blindly, the fog twisting around me, disorienting me until I couldn't tell which direction led back to camp. And then, as if guided by instinct, I stumbled into a clearing. A circle of stones, old and weathered, covered in strange markings. I stopped, panting, feeling an odd pull toward the center. But something in me resisted. It felt wrong, like a place of finality, a trap waiting to spring. The shadows circled the clearing, their forms drifting like smoke, each one murmuring in Hannah's voice, her laughter mingling with the chorus. They pressed closer, whispering, "Come with us, Ryan. Stay." My mind raced, torn between the desire to believe, to follow, and the primal instinct to survive. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to remember what was real, what Hannah would have wanted. Her last words echoed in my mind. "Move forward, Ryan. Don't get stuck in the past." I felt a surge of strength, a determination I hadn't felt in months. I opened my eyes, clutching the flashlight, its weak beam cutting through the fog. I stepped out of the clearing, refusing to let the shadows pull me in. The whispers grew frantic, angry, but I kept moving, each step drawing me away from the circle, away from the shadows. They clawed at the edges of my vision, their forms becoming erratic, distorted, as if they were losing power. And then, with a final defiant scream, they vanished into the fog, leaving only silence. I stumbled back to the RV as dawn broke, my legs weak, my heart racing. The fog lifted, the morning sun piercing through the trees, casting a warm glow over the forest. I climbed into the RV, my hands shaking, and turned the key. The engine roared to life, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. As I drove away from Devil's Den, I glanced back one last time. The forest was still, peaceful, but I knew the shadows lingered, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. I may have left Devil's Den, but the shadows stayed with me, their whispers echoing in my mind, a haunting reminder of how close I'd come to being one of them. And I knew that, in some way, I'd never truly be alone again. I arrived at Great Sand Dunes National Park right at dusk. The sun was setting over the endless stretches of sand, the dunes casting long shadows that made the landscape look otherworldly, as if I'd crossed into another realm. I'd been here before, briefly, on a rushed trip where I'd lost an hour somehow. Just lost track of time, I thought. But now I had days. Time to wander. Time to capture something more. As I parked the RV, a breeze carried sand across the windshield, blurring my view. The dunes were mesmerizing, shifting and rolling in a way that seemed almost alive. I couldn't wait to photograph them at dawn when the light would be perfect. I set my gear by the door and checked my watch. 6:42 p.m. I thought it'd be a simple night, dinner, sleep, sunrise shoot, but things quickly took a turn. The trouble started with my watch. As I cooked dinner, I glanced at it just to check the time again. It read 3:12 a.m. I frowned, tapping the glass. I must have knocked it against something, but I couldn't remember doing that. I checked my phone, expecting it to set my mind at ease, but it too read 3:12 a.m., though the seconds ticked on as if it were perfectly normal. What the? I glanced at the RV's dashboard clock. 3:12 a.m. A chill prickled down my spine. It had to be a glitch. I'd fix it tomorrow, I thought, pushing the unease aside, but when I looked out the window, I thought I saw movement in the dunes, a shadow just at the edge of the dark. I squinted, focusing on where I thought I'd seen it, but there was nothing. Only sand shifting in the evening breeze. The night felt off, like a pressure closing in around me. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that being alone in the dunes was playing tricks on me. But when I looked at my camera, flipping through the shots I'd taken earlier in the week, a few new ones appeared at the end of the reel. They were wrong. Grainy and distorted, they showed fragments of the dunes, but they were tilted, strange, like someone had taken them from the ground, looking up. The last one, though, it made my blood run cold. It was a photo of the RV from outside, a shadowy figure standing next to it. No one else was here. There was no way those shots could exist. I couldn't shake the dread that pooled in my stomach, the sense that something wasn't right, that somehow I was being watched. I shut off the camera, breathing deep, trying to steady myself. That's when I noticed the footsteps. They were right outside the RV, barely visible in the sand under moonlight. Long, narrow prints, almost like mine, but elongated, twisted. They seemed to appear out of nowhere, leading away from the RV and vanishing into the dunes. My pulse quickened. It had to be some kind of prank. Maybe another camper passing by and seeing the RV from the road. I forced myself to laugh, but the sound was hollow in the stillness. Something deep within me, though, knew better. I locked the doors and tried to sleep, but my dreams were scattered, broken. I kept seeing a shadow, shifting and moving across the sand. I heard a voice, my own voice, calling my name. It whispered, distant, yet somehow inside me. Jake, you left something. Come find it. I woke in a sweat, feeling the hours slipping away in a disorienting fog. The next morning, I tried to shake off the dreams, but the RV wouldn't start. I turned the key again and again, but it just sputtered, dead. My phone, fully charged the night before, was now at 1%, the screen flickering. This was impossible. I had enough battery to last for days, a backup generator, everything I needed. But somehow, all of it was gone. I was trapped, and I could almost hear the dunes laughing. I decided to head out on foot, hoping to find a ranger or signal somewhere higher up. But as I left the RV, something glinted in the sand, half buried. I knelt down, brushing it off, and felt my stomach drop. It was a broken lens from my old camera, the one I'd lost here last year. I stared at it, feeling a rush of memories, my hands trembling. I'd forgotten about that trip, how I'd been hiking the dunes, searching for the perfect angle, when I'd suddenly felt dizzy, lightheaded. I'd woken up back at my car, my camera damaged, an hour missing from my memory. I'd brushed it off at the time, but now it all felt too close, too connected. A voice drifted through the dunes, faint, almost carried by the wind. "Jake, you left something." The words froze me in place, my own voice echoing back to me, whispering in that hollow, haunting tone. "Come back, Jake." I stumbled back to the RV, my heart racing, but something had changed. The landscape around me was different. The dunes seemed taller, the sky darker. Everything had taken on a strange hue, a sickly, washed-out shade that made me feel as if I'd stepped into a dream I couldn't wake from. As I climbed into the RV, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror, but it looked wrong. My face was pale, gaunt, with dark hollows around my eyes. I looked like I'd aged years overnight, my skin stretched tight, my eyes sunken. "No," I muttered, gripping the steering wheel as if that alone would anchor me. But my reflection only stared back, mocking, a twisted grin spreading across its face. I looked away, heart pounding, and that's when I saw him, the figure from the photo, a shadowy outline standing at the edge of the dunes, unmoving, watching. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to go toward it. I stumbled out of the RV, my feet heavy, drawn toward the figure as if an invisible string were pulling me forward. The figure was clearer now, shifting slightly, a silhouette made of swirling sand and shadow. Its face was an echo of my own, hollowed and dark, its eyes voids, endless and empty. "Jake," it whispered in a voice that sounded like mine, but distorted, stretched. "You left something behind." I stared, horrified. "What are you?" My voice shook, sounding weak, thin. "I am you," it said, stepping closer, "the part of you that never left." The memories crashed over me. That missing hour, the feeling of losing myself here, in this endless desert, like something had been taken from me and never returned. I'd left a piece of myself behind, and it had grown into this thing, this wraith of sand and shadow. I backed away, panic clawing at my throat. "I don't want this. I want to leave." "You can't," it said. "Not until you take back what you left." It held out its hand, and there, in its grasp, was the broken lens from my camera, glinting darkly. I didn't want to touch it, but somehow I knew I had to. My hands trembled as I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold glass. A wave of memories hit me, images flashing through my mind. I saw myself, last year, stumbling through the dunes, feeling faint. A sharp pain in my chest as I fell. I'd left something here. My desperation, my loneliness, my regrets, like a scar in the sand. And it had become this thing. This part of me I'd buried, festering and waiting. I gripped the lens, my knuckles white, and felt a deep sense of acceptance, of release. "I'm taking it back," I whispered. "All of it." The figure shuddered, its form flickering like a mirage, its voice fading to a faint echo. "Remember me. Remember what you left." And then it was gone, a swirl of sand dissolving into the air. When I stumbled back to the RV, everything had returned to normal. My reflection looked like me again, haggard but whole. The engine started without a hitch, and my phone, somehow had full charge again. I left the dunes as the first hints of dawn touched the sky, the light washing over the sands, making them look less ominous, almost peaceful. But I knew I'd left something there, a part of myself that would forever haunt these dunes, a scar etched into the shifting sands. Even now, I sometimes catch glimpses of a figure in my peripheral vision, a shadowy silhouette that vanishes as soon as I look. I don't know if it's really gone, or if that part of me will forever wander the dunes lost in that forgotten hour. But one thing's certain. Once the sand takes something from you, it never truly lets go